Welcome, Season Sixers. As always, thank you for being part of our Color Success podcast family. I'm your favorite host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. Keep your eyes peeled for my brand new book coming out. It's called Cancel the Filter, where I share my experiences in the realm of mental health, both professionally and personally. Subscribe to colorsuccesspodcast.com to be on our waiting list. Seats are limited and being filled as we speak. We're also streaming on all your favorite platforms and socials. Whether you're on the go or comfy on the couch, you can tune in at your own comfort. As you know, we love growing discussions with our guests from our AAPI and minority communities. With so many friends and experts from different aspects of life, we love learning their stories and understanding what their success means to them. Let's get into it. Alan Jenkins is a professor of practice at Harvard Law School, where he teaches courses on race and the law, communication, and Supreme Court jurisprudence. Before joining the law school faculty, he was president and co-founder of the Opportunity Agenda, a social justice communication lab. Jenkins' prior positions have included assistant to the Solicitor General at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he represented the United States government in constitutional and other litigation before the U.S. Supreme Court, Director of Human Rights at the Ford Foundation, where he managed grant making in the United States and 11 overseas regions, and Associate Counsel to the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where he defended the rights of low-income communities facing exploitation and discrimination. He previously served as a law clerk to U.S. Supreme Court Justice Harry A. Blackmun and to U.S. District Court Judge Robert L. Carter. Jenkins is a frequent commentator in broadcast, print, and digital media on topics ranging from Supreme Court decision-making to racial equity to the role of popular culture in social change. He holds a JD from Harvard Law School, a Master's in Media Studies from the New School for Public Engagement. He recently published 1/6, the graphic novel, issue number 1, What If the Attack on the U.S. Capitol Had Succeeded? It can be purchased on Amazon or 16comicsstore.com. Alan, happy Friday, and I'm so happy that we get to touch base again today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. It's great to see you.
I sent out your bio to one of my colleagues and she was like, oh my goodness, like he is amazing. And I was like, yes, he is. So let's jump right in. What does justice mean to you?
You know, justice for me starts with opportunity and human rights. Opportunity is this idea that all of us deserve a fair chance to achieve our full potential, that opportunity should be equal, that we should have economic security and mobility and a voice in decisions that affect us, a chance to start over after missteps or misfortune, with what some people call redemption, and community, the idea that we're all in it together, that we share responsibility for the common good. And, you know, human rights is the idea that we all have rights simply by virtue of our humanity. Just by being alive and humans on the planet, we have basic dignity that shouldn't be violated by government or anyone else. So in our criminal justice system, for me, what that means is, you know, we need systems that prevent harm, that uphold the values of equal justice and accountability.
I couldn't agree more. And so here's the big question. Very easy question, Alan. Let me prepare you. So how is this consistent or inconsistent with the current state of our justice system?
Well, unfortunately, the U.S. criminal justice system is falling far, far short of those values. And there have been some improvements, including some improvements lately. But when you think again of those values I described, preventing harm, upholding equal justice and accountability, we're just not doing that right now in our criminal justice system. So too often the system causes harm rather than preventing harm through over-incarceration, through abusive police practices, through denying opportunity in communities. We're not focusing on prevention in the way we should. And even crime is actually historically low right now, despite what we might see in the news headlines. But all harm is problematic, and we want to actually focus on prevention, on things like drug treatment, on mental health treatment, which I know you're a champion of investing in underserved communities. And think about that accountability value. Too often we see that, for example, the rich and the powerful are not held accountable for the harm they cause. We see that often law enforcement, in the many terrible videos we've seen of unarmed people of color being abused or even killed by law enforcement often without accountability. That's often lacking. And then even for kind of everyday operation of our justice system, prison or jail punishes a lot of people, and it often doesn't result in true accountability. And finally, that notion of equal justice, and we know that our justice system does not treat all people equally. That how much money you make, what accent you might have, where you come from, the color of your skin, unfortunately affect the quality of justice that you get too often. So right now, we're falling short. We made some progress, particularly in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, the killing of Breonna Taylor and others, but we've still got a long way to go.
Help me understand this too, because we see the social media bits, and it's very clear when you're looking at it what is going on. And of course, people, social media's videos are clips, and obviously people are saying like context is omitted and so forth, which obviously there's truth to that. But when you see these violent acts from multiple angles with actual video footage, how do we go from we see someone brutally abuse somebody, no matter the circumstance, going back to basic human rights, to, oh my goodness, well, this person was using drugs, or, et cetera, how we criminalize someone before they get to the courts or the justice system. Help me understand that piece, because it boggles my mind.
Well, and there are a bunch of pieces of it, right? One is prevention, focusing on prevention so that we don't even get to that stage of harm being committed by one person upon another. And so again, I know that I've heard you talk many times on the podcast about the importance, the primacy of mental health and mental health treatment. And those are things that we should be offering to everyone on the front end before harm occurs. We've been through so much trauma as a nation.
Yes.
Between the COVID pandemic, in which 1 million Americans died and many, many more millions around the world. We haven't fully acknowledged that as a society. The tumult in our economy, and particularly for the lowest income people, lots of trauma that we have not really tried to even acknowledge societally, much less make sure that people have the treatment and the ability to heal. So that's crucial. Once harm occurs, I think there are a lot of pathways to accountability, many of which we've underinvested in. So, for example, the notion of restorative justice, of bringing people together, someone who has caused harm and someone who has experienced harm together, to talk through voluntarily, right? To talk through what's happened, to acknowledge the harm that was caused, to think about how can we actually restore the feeling of safety, the relationship, the material things. And so there's some great programs around the country. In Brooklyn, where I lived for many years, there's an organization called Common Justice, where people are voluntarily, if both sides, both the survivor of harm and the perpetrator agree, they're removed from the criminal justice system, and they talk through and very frequently resolve their differences. And there's an apology and a restoration. Mm-hmm. And that solution ranks much more highly with victims and survivors of crime than does prosecution and incarceration, which takes lots of time, which is very expensive and often also harms the families of people who are behind bars and the like. So, I think that's an important solution that we need to be thinking about that holds those values and that helps us to process. And then we have to demand equal justice. We have to ensure that everyone is treated equally. And then finally, to go back to the first part of your question, we need to really think about when and why we're criminalizing activity that should be dealt with in some other way. So, there are people still languishing behind bars for, use of marijuana in the, in the era of so-called tough on crime, conduct that now a growing number of states doesn't even believe to be harmful, much less a criminal act. We need to really be thinking about all of the things that we attach liability to. Loitering, for example, something that was primarily used to control poor people and people of color rather than to prevent any actual kind of nuisance. Let's be asking, should this be a criminal act? And if it should be, then should it be something for which the consequences are incarceration?
Right. And I think even when there's diversion programs, to really think a lot about how effective is it to return someone back to incarceration after they have completed mental health treatment and seem to be on the right path to not reoffending and extremely stable. And I think that's really difficult to kind of see from my side of, you really do see change and then they have to return to this environment. And as we know, there's a whole bunch of dynamics within a prison, within a jail that they have to revert to just for the pure safety of themselves. And so it is a multifaceted approach. And I really like that return to community focused, because as we know, jails and imprisonment have also been one of the solutions proposed for mental health treatment, because we don't have a lot of inpatient facilities anymore. And there's also that criminalization piece there. And so it becomes very, very complicated in that sense of, like you said, is this a criminal act? Is this better treated by providing mental health or other psychosocial resources versus returning people or thinking that incarceration is the only way?
I think that's right. And resources matter, right? There in California, you saw with Proposition, I believe it was 57, that redirected resources away from kind of a knee-jerk incarceration of people particularly for nonviolent and drug offenses, and reinvested the millions and millions of dollars that are saved when we don't choose that path in mental health resources and treatment and community care and the like. Those resource decisions are really important. And to your earlier point, if jail and prison are going to be any part of our society, then they need to be places of true rehabilitation.
Yes.
They should be places where there is not, you're not exposed to greater violence in prison or jail when you're under the control of our government and theoretically under the protection of our government than you receive or experience out in the world. If we're going to have prison and jail, we need to be using the best social science to understand how do we interrupt problematic and harmful and unlawful behavior? How do we give people the skills that they need to come out into the world and be more rehabilitated than when they came in? I think there's an active debate about whether and when prison and jail should ever be used, but right now it's a significant part of our society, and we need to make sure that those systems are actually focused on rehabilitation. In addition, and you touched on this, when people come out of prison or jail, we need to make sure we're ready to help them adapt to healthy behavior and economic participation. We need to, instead of stripping them of their right to vote and participate in the voice of our society, decision-making in our society, instead of telling them, well, you've been in prison, so now here's a list of, 100 jobs that you're now disqualified from doing. We may have trained you to be a barber in prison, and then you come out and you're prevented from getting your barber's license because you have been convicted of a felony. It makes no sense. It's not good for any of us. It's bad for our society. It's bad for the families of those people, and it prevents them from reentering society in an effective way.
I've got to tell you, the best lawyers, and I put it in quotes because they're not allowed to become lawyers, are people that have been incarcerated. They know the law. They know, and obviously we have to be aware of secondary gain in some senses, but they know way more about the law than the average citizen, just watching the news and so forth. And so I was going to say that, and you hit the nail on the head about civic participation. Those may be advocates, like you said, of decriminalizing marijuana convictions when many states have legalized it. So there's that double-edged sword there of not letting them participate at the same time, like recognizing, yes, there's accountability for certain things that people have done. So I wanted to shift gears just a little bit, and you wrote a graphic novel, What If the Attack on the Capitol Had Succeeded? And I love the fact that you went with this medium of a graphic novel versus a traditional academic journal or a book, which you could have very well done. But tell me more about your decision to go that route and what you were trying to communicate through your graphic novel.
Yeah, thanks for that. I might just have a copy of it here.
You might. I love it.
It's entitled 1/6, the graphic novel. So 1/6 being January 6th of 2021, when an insurrection was attempted that sought to overthrow our democratically elected government and halt the counting of votes in a free and fair election. And I should say it's available on Amazon and at 16comics.com, ONESIX, comics.com. The reason first, what the graphic novel is about, and then I want to make sure I answer your question about why a graphic novel. After the insurrection, the real insurrection in our country, I found myself waking up at 4 a.m. worrying about our democracy and our values, and the fact that the things that led to that insurrection, and by insurrection I mean the attack on the Capitol, the attempt to substitute fake electors in key swing states that Joe Biden won, the strong arming of election officials, everyday public servants, as well as the vice president. All of that came together in what was almost a successful insurrection or coup on January 6th. And so I was worried about that, and particularly the fact that so many of the forces that led to that day, the authoritarianism and anti-democratic principles, the win at any cost politics, the anti-Semitism and hate that drove a lot of the militia members and others who showed up at the Capitol that day, the disinformation, not only misinformation, but intentional disinformation, not only the big lie about who won the election, but lots of other details that I won't repeat here. Those are all still with us. And many of those forces have only grown stronger since January 6, 2021, in ways that almost make that day look like a dry run or a dress rehearsal. And so I created with my co-writer, Gan Golan, who is himself a New York Times bestselling graphic novelist, a comic book series that asks the question, what if the insurrection had been successful? And we chose a comic book for a number of reasons. One is I'm a comic book head. I love comic books and I love democracy. And so I hope that
I love Archie comics back in the day. So I can relate.
Yes. Big ups to Archie and Veronica. So, I hope that using a comic book to help save democracy was a viable strategy. And we can, if time allows, we can talk about the fact that I'm by no means the first to try to do that. But, I wanted a medium that would reach a large and diverse audience. So as you note, I could have written a law review article or a book. I've done both of those things. I've edited books and written law review articles. And, they're read by tens of people.
I'm glad we can talk about that. Not to mention, like, how often does it get distributed to the masses? Right. Okay.
Exactly. And, we have a large segment of our population that, is not going to sit down and read, a long tome. Number one, might have no interest or ability to read a law review article, but, also don't have the time and luxury to read the 820-page, House Select Committee report on January 6th, but who love democracy, who sense that something went terribly wrong on that day and can be reached through popular culture, in this case, a comic book. We're in a comic book era where all the big, or at least 2/3 of the big Hollywood films are derived from comic books. And popular culture has a way of reaching across divides of ideology, of age. If you're 80 years old in America, you grew up reading comic books or grew up around comic books. If you're 8 years old, you're growing up around comic books. So we wanted to reach people, not just the people who already agreed with our take on what happened, but also other folks who might be struggling with it or might not even have had the bandwidth to pay attention at the time. That certainly seems to be paying off. I've engaged with hundreds and hundreds of people around the country, across the political spectrum about this. We've sold thousands and thousands of copies of the book around the country. We gave away several thousand copies of the book. We gave copies to all of the election deniers in Congress. There are at least 150 of them.
I love that.
Including the new Speaker of the House is somebody who was one of the architects of attempting to oppose deny Joe Biden's victory. So we gave them all copies, but also some of the heroes in both parties who stood up for democracy in that moment and really saved our democracy. So, last thing is, in response to your question, there's a long history in comic books of lifting up democracy against autocracy and combating bigotry, helping to exonerate a death row somebody who was wrongly convicted and on death row. He was confronting corrupt politicians. Captain America, in his first issue, he's punching Adolf Hitler in the jaw. This is months before the U.S. entered World War II. Wonder Woman was fighting, the patriarchy, but also fighting authoritarianism and Nazism. So, long history there, and also long history of that alternate history, approach of the what if. So, Orwell's 1984 or Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood. Those are all what if stories that are designed to be warning signs, warning alarm bells about our current threats to our democracy and equality, and also calls to action, which I hope this book will be.
Yeah, and it's a lot of social commentary, as you mentioned, in comic books that really get to that piece. And I think that was perhaps one of the reasons why Barbie, the movie, really resonated with people, because yes, it was on the nose in terms of let's address the patriarchy, but I love fashion. And so there's that piece of like that intersectionality of, well, you can be beautiful and fight the man. So it was a great message. This is one way, as you mentioned, that you are addressing a lot of the anxieties that the masses felt. I mean, having to explain to my children, because we were watching some live footage and all that, they're like, what is going on? And so even though they were a lot younger than they are now, it really helped to engage in conversation about what this really meant in terms of what the attacks were, I guess, aiming to do, so to speak. So, I mean, you really talked about how can we preserve democracy and make it better. So in terms of social justice, what are a couple changes that you would like to see? I know it is a kind of an idealism question, but really we need people with these idealistic thoughts to have some implementation of them, even if it's a fraction. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'll talk briefly about the policy part of this, but then I also want to talk about just what everyday folks can do
Yes.
to advance justice and democracy. So, on the policy side, a lot of the rioters who showed up and attacked the Capitol on January 6th have been held accountable in a court of law, but almost none of the politicians and their enablers who participated in trying to overthrow our democracy have been held accountable in any way. And here, this goes back to our prior conversation. When I say held accountable, I don't necessarily mean prison or jail, although that may turn out to be appropriate for some, but rather accountable in the political process, an acknowledgement of what they did, a recognition that they should not be responsible. They should not be given the opportunity to hold the reins of government in the future, having shown that they violated our deepest democratic principles. And so the Constitution is clear about this. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to our Constitution says that if you took an oath of office as an office holder and then engaged in an insurrection, you are barred from holding future office going forward unless Congress pardons you. And so, but that has existed since right after the Civil War, when lots of people who were in office in the South, in the slaveholding South, that went into rebellion, engaged in insurrection, and they were prevented for almost a decade from being part of the political process because we knew what they would do if they got back into office. That part of our Constitution still exists, and it's still applicable here. And so one of the things that we've done in coordination with the comic book is to create a petition on Move On that people can sign to ask secretaries of state and local election officials to bar from office people who are demonstrated to have engaged in an insurrection on January 6th. So we're not asking for them to go to prison, not trying to take their voting rights away, as happens with, we discussed, happens with some people convicted of felony, but simply saying enforce the Constitution. And so that's one effort. People who are watching listening to your podcast can go to moveon.org or to 16 Comics Store and sign that petition. But then there are a lot of other things that everyday folks can do. So part of it is, what we call civic engagement. That means voting, but also, show up at town halls when your elected officials are discussing issues of the day. Think about, we've seen a rash of book bannings of all things in 2023 in the United States. People are and local governments are trying to ban books. Show up at school board meetings, at town hall meetings. Defend and protect your librarians, who are guardians of knowledge, and making sure that we can learn about each other. The idea that young people who are struggling with their identity would be prevented from reading about any book that discusses LGBTQ issues or identity, that material can literally help save lives.
Yes. And
it's being banned. So, I say the folks listening here, get involved in those issues. Certainly vote for truth and democracy and human rights, and insist upon it in your state and local government. Be in touch with your elected officials to talk about the importance of voting rights, for example, making sure that every vote is counted and that race is not used as a way of preventing people's vote from counting. And then, let's treat each other fairly and justly. Let's remember that we are all in it together, that we all have dignity. One of the things I hope you'll see in our comic book is that we really strove to treat everyone with dignity. There's a MAGA voter who shows up at the Capitol. There is a Capitol Hill staffer. There is a reporter. There's the story is character driven, and so we've created these fictional characters to help tell the story. And each of them we've tried to treat with empathy and dignity, rather than vilifying any of them. And that's important to how we all treat each other. I tell my students, empathy is one of your superpowers. You'll never persuade someone if you don't make the effort to understand them and where they're coming from. And who knows, they might even teach you a thing or two. So those are all things that all of us can do to help advance a notion of fairness and justice.
And I think a bonus question would be, how do we talk with our children about some of these things that are going on? Obviously, the huge thing is be kind to all people, no matter how they look, what their beliefs are and so forth. And these real things are happening around them, and they're not isolated. So how could parents even start conversations or continue to integrate that into daily conversation?
Yeah, well, so the first thing I'll say is you're more of the expert on that than I am. So I'll tell, but I'm a parent, and I'll tell you my thoughts. But I think there are people like you who are giving real kind of science-based and professionally based advice on this, and so I definitely defer to you and your colleagues in the field. But I think some of the advice for talking to our kids is actually the vocabulary might differ based on age, and the extent to which we share some of the sometimes uncomfortable details might differ. But I think a lot of the advice is the same, which is to start with those core values, that we need to treat everyone with respect and dignity, to be fair to them. The golden rule still holds, right? Treat everyone the way you would like to be treated. And to recognize that people, even people who we disagree with, who sometimes will do bad or harmful things, we don't know what they're struggling with. Doesn't mean that there shouldn't be accountability, or that we should put ourselves in harm's way, and we have to talk to our kids about how to stay safe. But I think we need to do that without the idea that some kinds of people are bad and some kinds of people are good, or that the ideas, the values that people hold make them kind of outside of the human community. And, that balance is really tough to be able to explain with so many things that are going on around the world and here at home, to, kind of decide how much of that you want to share with your kids, depending on what age they are, to be, constantly talking to them. I think, I guess the other and last thing I'll say is that as a busy parent starting out, I often thought that, like in the rest of my life, I could just check the box. Oh, I had that conversation. So now, like the kids are good. Let me move on to something else. But no, you got to have that conversation over and over and over again. And as they get older, or as they learn more and exposed to more, you have to have it in more sophisticated ways with them, and keep that dialogue open, even when they're teenagers who don't want to talk to you.
Yeah, it sounds like, they really do reflect based on your values and so forth. So, and we are on the same page on that, because I really, my kid may come home and say, so-and-so was mean to me today, or they didn't, you got really mad. And it's like, they may be going through something as well. And like you said, setting those boundaries are very, very important, and communicating how you feel, and at the same time, separating from the person. This is bad behavior, not a bad person. And continuing to share that empathy, even as adults, because I think a lot of times, like you said, there's villainization, there's demonization, and not to say that some folks aren't struggling with going to the dark side, if we're using a Star Wars metaphor. But I truly believe that the majority of people have both good and bad traits, and it's based on decisions. And if anyone's a Game of Thrones fan, that's kind of what the message is, right? We can, barring maybe one or two characters, we can really even root for them in some instances. In other cases, we're like, ooh, that behavior is like really not good for others in society. But I think that your graphic novel really will drive home the point to many people that is the case. So again, could you let people know where they can connect, where they can purchase the graphic novel, and so forth?
Yeah, thanks so much. So again, It's 1/6, the graphic novel, 1/6. The graphic novel is the name. They can find it very easily on Amazon for people who are on Amazon. And also our website where you can purchase it a little more cheaply than Amazon is 16comicsstore.com. So ONESIX comicsstore.com. And there's also a free education and action guide, as I said, so that people can download that and use it. We affiliated with a great organization called Western States Center in order to create that guide, so they can find it all right there. And we recently did a live stream on YouTube about democracy and equal justice, defending democracy in a post-1/6 world. And so people can just Google that or search for it on YouTube. It's still up right now.
Thank you so much, Alan. It was such a pleasure having this conversation. We kind of nerded out, but also really came in, and we're going to spread this to the masses as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for everything you do. Since we were connected initially, I've been consuming your past podcasts, and I just really love what you're doing, and very helpful in tumultuous times.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to announce that my book, Cancel the Filter: Realities of a Psychologist, Podcaster, and Working Mother of Color, is now available on Amazon through Kindle or a paperback copy. So get yours today. The link is in the description